My name is MC, and this is the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, prepared as part of the class Intro to Chicanx Latinx Histories, History 17th at the Claremont Colleges. The sanctuary movement began in the early 1980s. As the name suggests, it is characterized by the commitment of various congregations and cities throughout the U.S. to provide a sanctuary to Central Americans, particularly those coming from Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, seeking asylum in the U.S. This entailed providing shelter, protection, material goods, and even legal advice to these migrants, as many came into the U.S. undocumented. California had the most church-declared sanctuaries at 100. In addition, it had a few cities declaring themselves sanctuary, Santa Cruz being one of them. In a news article published by Santa Cruz Sentinel on the 25th of March 1986, Joanne Raymond writes that the city council members voted 5-2 to declare Santa Cruz a sanctuary for Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees, that is, quote, until they can safely return to their homeland or until they are granted federally recognized residency status, end quote. While seemingly for a humanitarian cause, there was an underlying political issue with the city declaring themselves a sanctuary for these Central American refugees, as stated by dissenting voters Katie Sears Williams and Joe Gio. By providing protections to these undocumented migrants, they were not only publicly challenging U.S. federal immigration laws, but they were also exposing the severe and horrific impact of U.S. involvement in Central America. During the Cold War, the U.S. supported many dictatorships throughout Latin America in order to keep the influence of communism from spreading. They invested billions of dollars in military and economic aid to help keep these dictators in power due to the fear that these nations, so close to the U.S., would fall to communism. This money largely went into the pockets of the small percentage, keeping those in power rich, while the general population suffered in extreme poverty. This wealth disparity, alongside other issues, fueled civilian uprisings. With the United States' support, drastic and brutal measures were used to squash potential rebellions and torture and kill anyone who was suspected of aiding these rebels. In El Salvador, the number of deaths and missing people reports turned out to be too numerous to keep count, which results in varying numbers. Internationally and domestically, the U.S. faced criticisms for their role in these mass murders. Even the U.S. Congress questioned their role, requesting evidence from the Reagan administration to prove that their aid had advanced human rights in Central America, especially after the reports of civilian deaths in El Salvador. In her book, Seeking Refuge, historian Maria Cristina Garcia writes, quote, members of the Reagan administration either denied or downplayed news reports of civilian casualties, claiming that only leftist guerrillas were caught in the crossfire. They reassured Congress that El Salvador was taking significant steps towards democracy and ending the violence, end quote. Congress relented and continued to send aid, thus fueling the violence. Millions fled, with many traveling to the U.S. to seek aid. This is where we see an exponential growth in the migrant population in the U.S., who are Guatemalan, Salvadoran, or Nicaraguan born in the 1980s. In 1980, 44,200 Nicaraguans, 63,100 Guatemalans, and 94,400 Salvadorans were recorded to have entered the U.S. By the end of this decade, in 1990, it rose to about 168,700 Nicaraguans, 225,700 Guatemalans, and 465,000 Salvadorans. The general American public did not respond well to the sudden influx of Central American migrants seeking asylum. Garcia wrote, quote, Americans generally perceive the Central Americans as yet another drain in their fragile economy, just barely recovering from the recession of the late 1970s, end quote. Additionally, the Reagan administration did not want to grant asylum to Central Americans. By doing so, they would be admitting that its policies were what caused the displacement and suffering of these peoples, as they were the principal supplier of military aid to the oppressive Central American governments. Instead, the U.S. called them economic migrants, stating that they did not come to the U.S. to escape potential harm, but to take advantage of economic opportunities in the U.S. With this explanation, the U.S. rejected most refugee applications from Central Americans. Only 2.6% of Salvadoran applications and 1.8% of Guatemalan applications were accepted from 1983 to 1990. For some Americans, they saw a moral dilemma around the large migration of Central Americans to the U.S. They believed that the U.S. had a responsibility to aid these migrants because it was largely due to their presence and influence in their nations that resulted in them being pushed out. From this questioning of U.S. policies sprung the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, which Garcia calls, quote, one of the most important acts of civil disobedience of the late 20th century, end quote. In addition to providing a safe house for these migrants, some churches spoke publicly, hoping to inform the American public of the reality in Central America and to challenge the narrative the U.S. government provided. Like Santa Cruz, entire city governments followed the examples of various churches, declaring themselves to be sanctuary cities. In Santa Cruz, this meant that, quote, the city police will not relay information to the Immigration and Naturalization Services about the detention of Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees, end quote. Councilman Arnold Levine called this portion of the declaration civil disobedience. However, he voted in support for the declaration at the end, after a call for the removal of this policy failed. What is significant about his and the other dissenting voters' opinion around declaring Santa Cruz a sanctuary is that they shared the most common argument against the sanctuary movement. As we now know, reactions to the sanctuary movement were mixed. Immigration, regardless of legality, has a history of not being welcomed in the U.S. Public declaration of a sanctuary and the publicity some refugees were receiving increased disapproval. They argued that if the priority was to keep these refugees safe, then providing sanctuary is in vain if these same refugees were being asked to share their stories, thus risking getting caught and deported. Instead, critics saw this movement as an attack on the U.S. government, as they openly opposed federal policies. And looking at the numbers, it seemed that the majority of the American public shared this view. There wasn't an overwhelming support for the city of Santa Cruz to declare itself a sanctuary. Quote, the sanctuary proposal was endorsed by several churches and by 1,500 residents who had signed the petitions, end quote. Notice how it says several churches and 1,500 residents. In 1986, Santa Cruz had about 49,000 residents, which means that there was a small minority fighting for the protections of these migrants. So what does this tell us? Well, for starters, American politicians were aware of what was happening in Central America. The American public either ignored the situation or did not know of it. Yet, for a small group of people, being able to influence and change local policies signifies that there was a larger change occurring. There was a shift in morality in the 1980s. The sanctuary movement garnered the support of many congregations and some politicians. By speaking publicly and by having migrants share their experiences and the hardships they faced, they brought light to events that the U.S. partook in, thus either educating the public or pulling them away from a passive sentiment. It provided another narrative for the undocumented Latinx migrants coming to the U.S. Not all came to the U.S. for economic opportunities. Quite a significant portion of migrants came for survival, as their home countries raged in war that took the lives of thousands. It brings a new perspective and understanding of these migrant populations. Thank you.